Relativism, philosophy, objectivity, Aristotle, truth, lies. It's time for a podcast on philosophy. Recently, synchronicitous events have occurred wherein several people have brought up topics to me concerning truth, being objective, whether or not logic is something that is universal, whether or not we should adhere to logical rules and principles in debate, and whether or not these things apply to life. I was recently tutoring somebody in philosophy and reviewing a lot of stuff that I had not read in probably 10 years. Everything from ancient Greeks to utilitarianism, Bentham, John Stuart Mill, David Hume. I was able to rethink a lot of things and reassess, reanalyze issues that I hadn't thought about in a long time, because I've sort of gone into my own world of thinking through really complex issues, and it had been a long time since I'd thought about more basic issues of philosophy. So tutoring somebody that's taking an intro class was a good way for me to put things back into perspective and to figure out that, at the risk of sounding pretentious, most people are still at a very basic level of understanding of these kinds of issues, even in terms of stuff that is considered basic philosophy. So over time it's occurred to me that because of the re-engineering of all education, the education system, particularly along socialist models, beginning with people like John Dewey and Horace Mann, people who were Unitarian Universalists, part of a sect that rejected things like miracles and divine revelation, inspiration, things like that, and adhered to a kind of deism and what they considered to be reason and rationality. It's become evident to me that education is no longer education. And I've known this for a long time, but it's been hammered home even clearer over the last few years that what's considered education largely in modernity, 90 to 95% of the time isn't that, but is in fact social engineering and a kind of conditioning and programming. So generally what you get in state schools, it's not that all the information is false, just like mainstream media or something like that. It's not that all the information is false, but that the receivers of the information do not have the ability to critically think and analyze. And when you aren't able to critically think and analyze, information is more of it functions more like propaganda. So a lot of websites and a lot of news sources and a lot of researchers and alternative media and people with conspiracy sites or whatever since they themselves oftentimes don't have proper foundations and don't have a good insight into human nature, will generally propagate things that aren't really helpful. So in other words, the underlying assumption is that if we just spew forth endless information, there's a sort of endless data stream without any kind of grounding or foundation by which to classify and place the information, we're essentially just receiving a program, being programmed, if you will. So a person has to have a proper education. They have to have critical thinking. They have to have a basic understanding of logic, and there should be a basic understanding of philosophy. And what constitutes philosophy in a philosophical worldview should be the starting point. Because without that, again, if you don't have the ability to properly use reason as the tool that it's meant to be, then one will be privy to the irrational swaying of all kinds of different bizarre positions. So, critical thinking, logic, when we talk about a philosophical worldview, classically speaking, philosophy is divided into three categories. And those categories are knowledge, which is epistemology, ethics, decisions about right and wrong, and metaphysics. What is being? What is it to exist? What is the status of something that exists? What does that mean to exist? What is meaning? And it's important to know too, as most people do not, that all three branches of philosophy, which make up what we might call our worldviews, are all interrelated. Each one of these branches necessitates or leads to claims about the others. So it's very fashionable, it's very popular in modern socially engineered education or philosophy to think that, for example, one can have ethical views that don't really have anything to do with metaphysics or epistemology. In other words, they don't have any necessary connection to, or they don't necessitate any claims in the other two branches. However, that can very easily and very clearly be shown to be false. In fact, any kind of claim that one makes at all, any kind of proposition, any kind of sentence, will in fact necessitate claims or logically lead to claims or beliefs in any of those three branches. So, off the top of my head, we'll just give an example. If one were to make an ethical claim, okay, such that one should tell the truth, generally we think that it is proper, fitting, and right for a person to be truthful. Now, setting aside, for the sake of argument, claims or arguments to the effect that there might be some situation in which it would be ethically correct to not tell the truth. Generally speaking, 99% of the time, at least most humans operate on the belief that it is right to tell the truth. Well, notice what we've said there. In saying that it's correct and right to tell the truth, we've talked about truth, okay? Truth, however, is a category of epistemology. So in order to know right and wrong, we're making a claim about what we know. Truth, therefore, is also bound up with and presupposed by the claim that we should tell the truth. Okay, so in making an ethically normative statement, that is ethically the norm to tell the truth, we've also made an epistemic statement, or we've assumed some more foundational epistemic premise. In this case, it is that we know, whatever the case is, we know that it's right to be truthful. Metaphysically, it also necessitates that we believe that there is a category of things that are true, which we distinguish from things that are false. So in constructing a sentence and making this proposition and having a certain belief about the rightness and wrongness of propositions and that one ought to be truthful, we've also made a metaphysical claim. And admittedly, when discussions about this kind of thing arise, admittedly it's not as obvious how we're making a metaphysical claim. And the reason for that, though, is not because it's not easy to substantiate the claim. The reason is that people just don't know metaphysics. Okay, so metaphysics is, as we said, the branch of philosophy that involves claims about existence or being. Sometimes the word ontology is used, and that's just a fancy word for being. And sometimes philosophers will make elaborate distinctions between metaphysics and being, but that's a more advanced issue. So on a podcast or a talk just dealing with the basics of philosophy and worldviews, we don't really need to go into depth about that. It's sufficient to know that a metaphysical claim is being made when we say that one should tell the truth. And there are many different ways to cut this. There are many different ways to demonstrate that. One is that when we make the statement that one should tell the truth, not only do we know or assume to know some category of things or set of propositions that are known as true, we also are giving a universal status to something true. Okay, so or whatever things we consider to be true. Even if we may be wrong, okay, even if the individual making the claim is wrong about what they think is true, it's still the case that in making such a statement, we are universalizing. We are saying that the categories of things that are true should always be adhered to and should always be told. You know, accepting those cases where one can make an argument that it would be profitable to lie. For example, if a person was hiding political prisoners in their basement and the Gestapo or some sort of group of thugs came by to kill the individuals in your basement, and you said there are no individuals in my basement, that would be an example of a situation when it would be just to lie. But if we're setting aside those examples and we're talking just about what's normative here, not the anomalies, but what's normative is to tell the truth, the ethical claim we've made. We've then made an epistemic claim in that we know some category of propositions or beliefs about the world which we believe are true, which fit into some category of truth. And so that covers the epistemic branch of a worldview. And then we've also made a claim about existence, that there exists some category of things that are true. There is some classification, something about truth that makes it correct or appropriate, as opposed to the propositions or claims or things that we believe to be false or are false. So it becomes evident then that just even in a simple claim, even if we haven't thought these things out, because these are the kinds of things that philosophers think about, these are the things that philosophers reason out, even if we haven't thought this stuff out or thought very deeply about it, we're still making, right, claims that necessarily go along with even such a basic and simple claim as we should tell the truth. So, in other words, bound up with a simple sentence, which we think might be, something very basic. We should tell the truth. We can't get any deeper than that, right? I mean, surely that's just evident and clear, and doesn't really bring a whole lot of other facts along with it. We see that with philosophy, and with using philosophy, and with back to this issue of a proper grounding in education, in a classic education, we see that such a claim is not, in fact, the most basic that we can make. There are all kinds of other things that have to be the case that we're automatically sort of committed to, right? So, as I said before, it's sometimes trendy amongst academics and philosophers to think that, for example, there might be some philosopher who's an ethicist, okay, and so he's going to primarily be concerned with ethical questions, and he doesn't think that issues like metaphysics matter anymore, which is also trendy, and that epistemology is we don't really have to worry about that because everything is relative, so we can't really know anything for certain anyway. So what we should really be concerned with are just sort of pragmatic, practical questions of trying to figure out what we should and shouldn't do. So ethics is all that's left of philosophy. The other two branches are bankrupt. We've grown out of that. We don't need that anymore. That's medieval, classical, ancient world, superstitious thinking, right? David Hume, the Enlightenment philosopher, is one of the important figures who brought us to this point, okay? And most of David Hume is completely awful, except for a few crucial insights which are very useful. And as we progress through some of the philosophical discussions here, we can go into more depth about where there are useful points in David Hume. But for the issue at hand, sort of a basic intro to a philosophical worldview and a philosophical approach to questions and why these things matter, we're going to step aside from that. So the person who's the ethicist, right, doesn't think that, or doesn't care that, in making a very basic statement about truth, that there are metaphysical issues that are bound up with that. But he doesn't care, right? He's an ethicist, so who cares what the guy down the hall at the university, who's the quote metaphysician who focuses on metaphysics, brings to the table. Well, this division of education and academia into all these little different niches and specialities, the specialists, okay, this is part of the problem. And granted, given the complexity of the world, everyone will of course be involved in some kind of specialization, but the idea that one cannot have one cannot encroach upon these other subjects because they aren't a specialist in that field is completely ridiculous, because all that ends up doing is compartmentalizing knowledge. And so this itself actually is part of social engineering. And so a very complex system can actually be run and corrupted very easily because of compartmentalization. So right, the person who's the biologist, for example, at the university, doesn't know anything about philosophy and simply assumes that biology is the end-all be-all of answers. Biology solves all questions. Life is basically just a sort of material process, as might be held by most university biologists. And this material process doesn't really give us answers about this irrational, deterministic process. Doesn't give us answers to those old speculative questions of metaphysics and epistemology. Those things don't matter anymore. Why? Well, they just don't. See, because when you start questioning the assumptions of the know-it-all biologist at the university, see, you're just doing philosophy again, right? You're still a philosopher. You still think that sitting around and asking questions and, wanting to get to the truth of the matter, that's all that old school medieval stuff, because there's no truth. The only truth that is the apparent truth, quote unquote, of biology, which leads to just a practical, materialistic, Darwinistic assumption of mere power relations. Right. So there's nothing beyond the social Darwinistic or survival of the fittest scheme, and everything that's going on amongst humans is just simply manipulation and power relations. By that, what we mean is that there is no truth other than the truth of those who wield the power. Unfortunately, might makes right. Now, I'm not saying that every biologist believes this. What I'm saying is that those are the kinds of statements that one would get from that type of professor or that type of mindset. Other disciplines would have very similar approaches. People in the physics department, have the idea that a certain view of physics, explains everything. So it's very ironic that in modern man's quest to destroy all previous knowledge and to have a specialization in some sort of obscure field, that at the same time he wants to universalize and totalize that very discipline. So again, biology becomes the end-all be-all explanation of all things. But the problem with that is that the biologist, for whatever insights and correct propositions and beliefs that he comes to in biology, that doesn't in any way answer any of these more foundational and basic questions and assumptions. See, the biologist is just a guy who's had a particular interest, gone to school, did the right things, joined the right group, so forth, so on, did well on his tests, so that he could get to the point of being the biologist at the university. And I'm not indicting biologists. What I'm saying is that there's a reason that guy ended up a biologist and not a philosopher. And much of that simply had to do with his own tastes and predilections. It didn't really have a whole lot to do with what was somehow magically or immediately present to him as truth. In other words, such that biology became clearly and self-evidently true to him, and questions of philosophy, were somehow relegated to the dustbin, right? Because this guy he probably already had an interest in those kinds of questions. But just because, this is great from Socrates' Apology, or Plato's Apology, where Socrates goes around and asks the townsfolk of Athens why they do the things that they do and believe the things that they believe. And what ends up being the case is that the people who chose those disciplines chose them for reasons that really didn't have anything to do with reason itself, right? The artisan was raised to be an artisan. And so he believes that the answer to all things is simply being an artisan. That's what everything means. But Socrates correctly understood that this itself was very short-sighted. So the discourse ends up, as we may know from basic philosophy if you've read the Apology, the discourse ends up being that Socrates is actually the wisest man because he has questioned all the different answers that the different walks of life have given for the meaning of all things. So the politician believes that everything is about politics. The poet believes that everything is summed up and explained simply in poetry. The artisan, again, believes that everything is about shipbuilding. But Socrates realizes that none of these are the totality explanation. They're only little parts of life. And so in the same way, the reason philosophy is relevant and matters is because we're only blinding ourselves to avoid these kinds of issues. It's only harming ourselves to assume that we know when we may not, right? So the great irony of all this is that the relativist, the person who believes that there's no objective truth, we can't know anything for certain, nothing's sure, nothing's grounded, those are generally the most dogmatic, intolerant people. Why? Well, they're arrogant. They haven't actually questioned their assumptions of truth. And so the philosopher is actually in the advantageous position, the true philosopher, the one who has discovered truth, because he's been willing to question, he's been willing to consider different positions objectively to see which ones stand and which ones fall. So, for example, when we take propositions like there is no truth, nothing is true, and when we begin to question those things themselves, those foundational propositions, remember, as we said earlier, the foundations of philosophy revolve around those three branches that make up a worldview. And we all have a worldview, we all have a philosophy, whether we admit it or are cognizant of it. It's avoidable. In other words, everyone has some kind of view about the world, even if they say, I have no view of the world, even if they say, I am completely apathetic. Well, that is itself a kind of view of the world. It's an apathetic worldview. When we consider relativism, and we consider a belief or a proposition such as there is no truth, nothing is true, or no one can know the truth, any of these, they all boil down to essentially being the same kind of statement. And they can actually, in logic, they can actually be written out in logical form as all sort of having the same structure or the same value. What we find is that the statement that there's nothing true is a very simple and basic contradiction. Okay, so in philosophy, we are starting with a foundational point of saying that things should be sensible, things should be consistent, things should be reasonable. We should operate that way. Now, somebody may come along and say, no, we should not. We should not be consistent. We should be inconsistent. Well, the problem with that is that one is still giving an ought, a should, right? One is still giving an ethical view. One should do this, right? We should be untruthful. We should be dishonest. We should be irrational. The problem with that is that contained in the claim that we should be irrational is still some belief in rationality and consistency, right? Because in order for something to be universalized, to say that this is something that should be done in all cases, assumes, again, some sort of broader, overarching, or underarching standard of what should be done. Okay? In other words, it doesn't avoid a universal claim. It falls back into being a universal claim. And for something to be a universal claim, we're saying that this holds, right, in all cases. So, to say that nothing is true, or to say that all things are relative, or that contradictions, that all things are contradictions, is itself a contradiction. Because it still requires some sort of universalized standard or measure or claim. And that's unavoidable. And since it's unavoidable, it shows that it's completely destructive. One could not truly believe and operate and live that way for very long without very, very dire consequences. If you truly believed that all things were relative, well, taken absolutely, then you're essentially a god yourself. I mean, you could, if all things are relative, there are no laws, or there's nothing binding anything, well, then, you know, can you make yourself fly? Can you cause yourself to suddenly be 400 feet tall? Can you, control time? Can you make time move in reverse? Well, no, of course not. No human can do those things. And so there are clearly in those cases, those are absurd examples, but there are things that bind us. So even if a person isn't willing to admit extreme relativism, they may be willing to say, well, okay, maybe not those extreme examples. We're finite, so we're limited by certain bodily exterior properties that we're not able to do those things. But when it comes to epistemics and when it comes to ethics, we are not limited. There are no truths, there are no laws, there are no rights and wrongs, and we don't know anything, right? So the person may admittedly shy away from metaphysical relativism and want to say, well, we may be limited in our existence, right? Ontology, metaphysics, but we're not limited or bound by any kind of rules or laws or standards in right and wrong and in what we know, because we can't know anything for certain. Well, let's examine that. Is it the case that we can't know anything for certain? Well, what about the claim that we can't know anything for certain? That seems to be a pretty strong claim. How does that guy know that we can't know anything for certain? In other words, bound up with the claim that we can't know anything for certain is a statement about a universal state of affairs. It is always the case with humans that they may not know with certainty anything. But wait a minute. We're saying that that's not the case. See, so this also is a contradiction. It is completely contradictory to say that it is universally the case that nothing is universally the case. That is a contradiction. It doesn't work. You are saying, I am absolutely certain that nothing is absolutely certain. And for any kind of discourse, any kind of progress, any kind of dialectical reasoning and discussion and dialogue to get anywhere, both parties have to admit some kind of rules or standards or laws. Right? So we have to have laws of logic, laws of argumentation, rules by which we can determine truth and falsehood, ethical rights and wrongs, etc. And the person who is just being trendy, because this is the air that we breathe, relativism, this person simply hasn't thought this through. Or, if they have thought it through, they've actually made a conscious decision because of the implications that I'm talking about, right? There are all kinds of implications for admitting that there's truth. If there is truth, then that means we're bound by it. And we can't just believe anything we want. We have to believe the things that are true and shun the things that are false. We have to do the things that are right and shun the things that are wrong. And the great insight into human nature that a lot of philosophers don't have is that human beings don't want to accept truth. They don't want to do what's right in many cases. Humans, in fact, love to do what's wrong in many cases. Humans do not want the responsibility of facing up to what is true and what is right. Because there's a tremendous responsibility involved in that, right? That might involve admitting that one has been wrong. And we all know that humans don't want to admit when they're wrong. We all know that humans don't want to change their ways. They're very hard-headed, become very set in their ways. And so the bad part is that when society as a whole adopts relativism or becomes socially engineered into relativism and enjoys being told what they want to hear, what they think will absolve them from responsibility, from blame, right? That all things are relative, nothing matters, do whatever you want, there are no consequences. We see social incohesion and social breakdown. And this is self-evident, very clear. Why? Because if there is nothing right or wrong, then it doesn't matter if I rape, steal, and pillage from my neighbors. There are no consequences. There are no standards beyond the immediate, possible consequences of getting caught stealing. There's nothing actually wrong with stealing. There's nothing actually wrong with murdering. If I get away with it, if I'm willing to risk it, and I get away with it, then I've benefited. And this, of course, fits along with that ethical relativism that's tied in with a sort of Darwinistic, materialistic mode of thinking, that biologically dominated mode of thinking, whereby all things are solved by or explained by materialistic process. So because we all do have beliefs about right and wrong, even if we say that we have no belief about right and wrong. We have, therefore, a belief about right and wrong, and it is that we have no belief. That is still a belief. So, it becomes very clear that philosophy is inescapable. We can't concoct clever arguments that get rid of philosophy. We can't arbitrarily say, well, I just don't care. We just don't care. Those things don't matter anymore. Now, one may choose to do that, right? One may decide to avoid philosophy, to believe that there are no objective truths. As I said a minute ago, that's very appealing to humans and the way humans are. It's very appealing for them to decide to believe something. Well, I just decide to believe in relativism because I think that that will be easier for me, and I will get away with, whatever things I may have done wrong in the past, or it will absolve me from guilt or responsibility in the future. The problem is that you don't get away with it. You don't actually escape responsibility. This is one area where the existentialist philosophers have been correct. You are condemned to be free in the sense that you are responsible for your actions regardless of whether you want to be or not. You are an operating agent in this world. As long as you are a self with existence in this world, a being, an individual in this world, you have actions that you must do. You must interact with people. Even a hermit must have some kind of interaction when the other monks bring him food. Right? So it's inescapable. You're going to be an actor in this world. You're going to be a knower in this world, and you're going to have some kind of existence in this world. So we're back to those three branches of philosophy. And no matter how much one wants to believe relativism, to be exempted from consequences, to be what one thinks is free. You see, relativism is actually a pseudo-freedom. It presents to man a belief that he's free by choosing to have no beliefs and no knowledge. It's actually a trap. In fact, it's a very dangerous psychological trap. For example, the more that I live in accord with my relativism, the more dangerously and self-destructively I live. Because if there are no morals, no rights and wrongs, it's all relative. Objectively, I'm speaking. Most relativists will admit that there are social conventions. There are town laws, city laws, state laws, etc., by which we have, erected a sort of legal social code that helps things to function. But beyond that, there's not really anything wrong with doing actions X, Y, Z. The problem with adopting this view is that it ultimately is self-destructive. Because if I live such that there are no truths, not only do I never attain truth, I also destroy truth for myself. I also destroy the truth that is myself, you see. So, let me give you an example. In one of the most relativistic philosophies in the world, something like Tibetan Buddhism, it is very clearly the goal of the meditation practitioner who at least wants to achieve the high levels of, quote, enlightenment. It is the goal of that individual to not have an individual psyche. the individual is viewed as evil. All particularity, all individuality is itself the great evil. And so in that philosophy, because it is the ultimate relativism, because any kind of words or thoughts or specific instances of truth or sentences or statements or propositions, those are all separate and divided from the monistic one, the all, the thusness. You see, all individuality is distinguished from the totality of all other things. So anytime you individuate, anytime you express a proposition, statement, something true, you are dividing it and conceiving of it as divided or separate from the all, the monistic one. Even the conception of the one, in that view, is itself harmful, because it still conceives of some aspect of the totality of reality that is not itself the totality. In other words, the conception that you have, or the word that you speak, is not itself the totality of reality, and so therefore it is also flawed, evil, bad, so forth. So this is a great example of why all of this matters, because it's very trendy for people who adopt relativism to go into something like Eastern religion. And all the Eastern religions, for the most part, share this same sort of anti-logic, anti-reason, irrational, flight into what people call mysticism, but it's not actually mysticism, because there can be a genuine mysticism that is itself enlightening and is rational. People just always assume that it is the great Eastern assumption that rationality is somehow antithetical or opposed to the mystical, and that is not really the case. There's not really any reason to believe that, other than the fact that elements within the Western tradition of philosophy have exalted the Enlightenment's view of reason. Okay, so we shouldn't confuse a specific era in history and its exaltation of what it believed to be human reason with reason, and set that over against what is mystical or supra-rational, or what transcends the rational. But that's, of course, what's trendy to do. It's trendy to believe that there are some sort of shortcuts beyond, learning basic philosophy, learning basic logic, basic critical thinking, basic metaphysics. There's some sort of shortcut to, through the irrational, through, staring at a rock wall and envisioning yourself not having a mind. Right? This is the practice of the deep hermetic practice of the lamas, is to lose the particularity of their psyche into the one. And that is absurd. That is the end result, but see, of relativism. But see, it becomes evident why relativism and having a relativistic philosophy, that one would find something like Tibetan Buddhism very appealing, because it would be a further step in trying to be consistent. And that's, again, a great irony here. The person who's adopted a philosophy of inconsistency throughout their lives is progressing towards, in other words, there's an inherent operative principle of consistency at work in trying to be more and more inconsistent. You see, and that's a great irony. Just like it's ironic that the relativists are the most dogmatic, because they have the most to lose. Okay, so a person like Socrates, who believes in truth, who knows some true things, and is in constant search of truth, that person has more to gain from being wrong, right? So that kind of person wants to be corrected if they're wrong because they love truth. They know what's true, and they want to know more truth. So that person is actually more humble because they stand to gain from being corrected. The relativist, on the other hand, has everything to lose from being corrected. The relativist has committed himself to irrationality. And as we've said, it's self-destructive. And so they have a vested interest then in being dogmatic. They have a vested interest then in utilizing power in some way to, for example, defame or by ad hominem attack the person who is opposed to relativism. And you will see this very clearly whenever you have debates with people who espouse relativism. They will go crazy on you. They will call you every name in the book. They will destroy your character. And again, for them, they think that this is no big deal because there is no truth. So it doesn't matter if I do something logically incoherent and nonsensical, right? Which it is. It is logically incoherent and nonsensical to attack someone personally on the basis of, well, you're an idiot, and your belief in truth isn't the case because you're fat. So that would be a logically incoherent, nonsensical, non sequitur. It doesn't follow from being fat that what the person's saying is wrong. Right? Being fat has nothing to do with being right or wrong. But since a person who believes in relativism and has committed themselves to that kind of a philosophy doesn't think that there's right and wrong, you can't expect them to be consistent or to uphold some kind of belief in being just, right? That person is unjust. They do not believe in being just, therefore in argumentation and discussion and debate. That person is going to be unjust. Why? Because again, men have something to lose from being wrong if they're committed to relativism. Because you see, relativism is a totality view. It is itself a tyrannical view. And in my own personal assessment, this is somewhat more speculative, I actually think that relativism itself is a psychological trap that people are stuck in. And they become so brainwashed and stuck in it that they don't even know how to get out of it. And they're very afraid of coming out of it because of what it may mean. Like we said, relativism means that there are laws and truths and rights and wrongs that bind people. And that responsibility is something that frightens people. So it's much easier, so they think, to flee from rationality. And so that's why I want to title this, The Flight from Rationality, The Flight from Reason. And you'll notice on my blog I have at times been critical of rationality and reason in the sense of the misconstrued Enlightenment version of it. Okay, so I want to be very clear about that. I exalt reason. In fact, I would give reason a better place, I think, than the Enlightenment philosophers. Because they fell prey, many of them, to the same errors, as I pointed out, of the biologist, who has the totality view of all of life and reality based upon their own personal existential experience with one discipline or one science. And so in the same way, the Enlightenment philosophers were very prejudicial against religion, for example, or theism or theology, largely because of the abuses of the theology of their day. And so science, quote unquote, was exalted to a position much like the biologist might assume, right, that he has all of the answers to everything, simply because he's gone down a path of accepting biology as his chosen profession. Now that's not to say that biology doesn't give us answers and doesn't produce things. It does. But it would be like going to a factory, or let's say we went to Microsoft and we walked into the modem department. Well, the people that produce the modems, let's say for the sake of argument that the modem department, that everyone in there is completely and perfectly proficient in modems. But they don't know anything, for the sake of argument, say about the screen. Well, we wouldn't conclude that because they work at Microsoft and because they have an integral function in producing modems, that they therefore know everything about Microsoft and everything about computers and everything about the business side of computers. In fact, many of the modem producers probably don't know that much about economics. So when we consider the totality of Microsoft, it would be evident very clearly that people in the modem department do not have a totality explanation of the entity that is Microsoft as a whole. Right? I mean, there are probably people working there who don't know anything about the history of Microsoft. Right? So in the same way, it would be folly to assume that some one discipline or some one science or even science, which is itself just simply a method or tool to getting at answers, that therefore is the totality explanation and meaning of all things. But as we said, this is more so a principle of human nature, to want everything to be explained in a certain simple way that is generally what they've chosen and not what they've come to through rigorous questioning, debate, and research. In other words, Socrates in the Apology, which is of course one of the great places to start with philosophy. Socrates' Apology is a great example of that. And so anyone who wants to embark on philosophy, I would encourage them to emulate Socrates. Because in order to love life, to appreciate our existence and what we know, and to know the good and to do the good, ethics, metaphysics, epistemology, we should have a broad approach. And contrary to what's trendy, contrary to what has been socially engineered, it's actually pleasing and more broad-minded and more tolerant to believe in truth and to be objective and to seek objectivity, to strive for it, to strive for the good, to know the good, and to reject the false. And so relativism, therefore, is false. It is a contradiction. It must be rejected. It is self-destructive. It is bad for the individual's own psyche. It is not true, and therefore it must be rejected. We must embrace reality. We must not flee from reality. The flight from reality into relativism is in fact a flight into a psychological prison of one's own making.